December 2, 2002 Observer Newsletter, UFC 40 WWE has money-losing quarter by Observer staff. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 950091228. ISSN 10,839,593. December 2, 2002. When watching the build-up the 2 days before and during the UFC show on November 22 for the Ken Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz match, it was like something you've always known was thrown right in your face. You saw all the WWE's problems when you had another organization doing a great job of building a match that you just had to see. In every aspect of business, the WWF used to be the dominant force, where nobody could touch them on. They were outdone by an inexperienced organization with a relatively small office staff. Granted, timing is everything. They had a match that people have been wanting to see since March 5, 1999, with a scene played a zillion times in clips where Shamrock climbed on the cage and yelled at a cocky Ortiz, who had just put on a shirt that read "Gay Mesder is my bitch," after a win over Ken's fighter guy Mesder, and flipped off Ken's corner. John McCarthy had to pull Ortiz away, or there probably would have been an unscheduled match nearly 4 years ago. Whatever one wants to say either positively or negatively about the match quality on UFC 40, it was far from the best collection of actual matches in UFC history, but it was also easily the best atmosphere for a show ever. The production values were at WWE levels, the video packages blew away anything WWE has done in years. The interviews by the main eventers blew away the interviews on WWE because they were interviews that understood their purpose. And keep in mind they are somewhat limited by the constraints of sort of reality, wove a storyline with more intensity than anything WWE has been able to create this year. The WWE has a crew of writers whose job is specifically to script things like this, and instead reality scripted a better storyline. The announcing has judged on pro wrestling standards as opposed to sports standards, that of hyping the product and building excitement in the matches and building up future stars and matches, blew away WWE, largely due to Joe Rogan of Fear Factor fame being so good that it left people like Taz and Jerry Lawler, and even Boss Rutan, in the dust. With the various celebrities at the show, topped off by Vin Diesel, Muhammad Ali, which meant that UFC has now had the three most famous worldwide sports names of the past 25 years at its shows since Zuffa took over Ali, Mike Tyson and Michael Jordan, and George Clooney. It was reminiscent of when WWF first broke through nationally in 1984 to 1985. A show built to the main event and made the big match seem more special than any WWE match since Hogan vs. Rock. And when it was over, you knew what you wanted to see next, because the guy who won the semi-main event and the main event won clean and strong, and are now on a collision course. Granted, because the WWE has a huge base audience and weekly television, the UFC buy rate will pale in comparison even to a low WWE show. But the fact UFC was able to draw a gate as large as all but the largest in WWF history in the US without weekly television and little in the way of mainstream media speaks volumes. The fact they did it during a time period when people seemingly don't want to pay for tickets to live events makes the lessons even stronger. Make no mistake about it, the success or failure of shows has far less to do with the quality of matches presented, or quality of matches on paper, as much as the quality of the hype leading to the matches. Shamrock and Ortiz, more so Shamrock, did the best money interviews in sports entertainment this year. Somewhere along the road, most of pro wrestling lost sight of interviews and hype that get people wanting to see a match and stick in your gut to where you have to see it. A few years ago, when business was booming, interviews were changed to extemporaneous speaking with the idea of getting pops from the live audience, getting catchphrases over, and working in punchlines for scripted jokes. Wrestling was so over at the time that it worked. Today, that's no longer the case, but the lessons from the past have been forgotten and considered dated. Then, when put in application in 2002, they worked to a charm, with the proof in the pudding being the huge walk-up business from the late hype that WWE hasn't been able to get for its shows in a long time. Remember when they were in San Diego for a SmackDown and made a point of noting how great it was that they had a 1,000 ticket walk-up? A few of the old-timers, like Hulk Hogan, Mick Foley, Paul Heyman, Vince McMahon and Ric Flair, and to an extent people like Rock and Triple H on occasion sometimes do interviews like that. But they are the exception. Rock vs. Hogan had the intensity working in, even being taken down by some of the angles, after the opening face-off interview, which was a classic example of how to build a match. Rock vs. Brock Lesnar, which was the second biggest match this year in the US, did not have the interviews, but did have the great video training clips that gave you the idea you were seeing two guys training their ass off to be the best and there was something tangible happening. The best examples this year were really in boxing, with both Lewis vs. Tyson and De La Hoya vs. Vargas, where the boxing people were able to convince you of what the basis of most big money drawing fights really are. Two famous people that the public knows, that don't like each other, for a reason the public understands, wanting to beat the hell out of each other. Real or contrived doesn't matter, it's the ability to get the fan in the gut saying, I want to see these guys fight. The result was, it was the talk of Las Vegas, a city where it's hard for anything short of a major boxing match to garner that kind of attention because there is so much going on. It drew a North American MMA record-setting crowd, a sellout 13,770 to the MGM Grand Garden Arena, and a gate reported at $1.5 million. The first MMA show ever to crack seven figures. We should have confirmed official totals in next week's issue. If the gate total is accurate, Shamrock vs. Ortiz would be the fourth highest grossing match in the history of U.S. sports entertainment, trailing Rock vs. Steve Austin at WrestleMania 17 in Houston, Hulk Hogan vs. Randy Savage at WrestleMania 5 in Atlantic City, and Hogan vs. Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3 in the Pontiac Silverdome. It's funny, because Shamrock was considered a bad interview in pro wrestling. They gave him a character where he screamed and lost control, which was effective early on, to cover for his weak interviews. Yet, in UFC, some of his promos for matches with the likes of Hoist Gracie, Dan Severn, Don Frye, Tank Abbott, which actually never took place, and Tito Ortiz are the best interviews in UFC history. Friends of Shamrock's have tried to explain this as Ken, unfortunately, can only do good promos when he really believes in the subject. The best wrestling promo guys, whether they be Flair, Ole, and Arnold Anderson, Dusty Rhodes, Jim Cornette, and Foley, were able to make themselves believe and bring some form of reality in their own minds to this fiction. It really hit the night before the fight, when the two went back and forth on the best damn sports show period. The show doesn't do monster ratings, but for anyone who saw the show, the buzz on the fight was huge. It did exactly what a great promo piece should do. It wasn't funny. It wasn't scripted. But it made you want to see the fight, even when the argument got down to what would be WWE scripted levels, where Ortiz said that John McCarthy is going to stop the fight when you poop in your pants, and Shamrock responding that if he does, he'll wipe it on Ortiz's face. But the delivery of those lines made it seem far more real than when WWE wrestlers would be given similar verbiage. MMA purists, who don't understand that pure sportsmanlike MMA doesn't sell tickets to the masses, were against what they considered an embarrassing display. But the fight left a lot of other important lessons. On September 22, 2000, one of the UFC pioneers and Shamrock's early rival, Dan Severn, who fought regularly but not against the top competition, returned to UFC for a main event against Pedro Hitzo. It was a sad situation, as within seconds it was obvious Severn was going to get blown out, and it was over in 92 seconds. Severn, in his youth, would have been able to take Hitzo down, and would have been competitive with him. At the age of 42, that was no longer the case. It was a reminder as a kid, watching Ali, well past his prime, take a horrible beating from former sparring partner Larry Holmes. And even worse, when Ali came back in a fight most have tried to erase from history, for a payday, and couldn't even handle Trevor Berbick. It's a lesson Kurt Angle had better think about, even though he's not quite that old, due to all the injuries he's suffered as a pro wrestler and a 6-year layoff while the athletes who have been consistently training have evolved, when making the decision that I'll bet he's already made. Shamrock was totally blown out in a one-sided fight that most consider the most important in the 9-year history of the UFC. The quality of the fighters, Ortiz in particular, has improved greatly even in the past few years. Rogan noted that the world of real fighting has taken more strides in evolution over the past 10 years than it did in the previous 700 years combined. Maybe an exaggeration, but Shamrock, at 38, has more stand-up skill than he did 6 years ago when he was the biggest star in the sport. Unlike speed and reflexes, his other strong suit, physical power, is a trait you can retain at an older age. But time stands still for no man, and he wasn't even competitive. It was also a scary lesson of exactly where another pro wrestling star, Don Frye, truly would stand, no matter what his one-loss record states, among the top echelon. Shamrock knew this was the most important fight of his career, and it was not a success. Shamrock went from being viewed as the world's most dangerous man, to getting a rep as being an overhyped sham in some circles. He knew history would record which one of his legacies was most accurate based on this fight. But it was not to be. Shamrock's MMA record now stands at 8-5-2, and the reality is, since he returned in 2000 after a few years with the WWF, his only 2 wins have come against Alexander Otska and Sam Adkins, both fighters with terrible records. The Frye fight was a competitive war that renewed his mystique, because Frye himself has a mystique. So many were looking at the idea that since Fry would destroy Ortiz, a myth shattered badly, that Shamrock would somehow win this fight, even though most in the fight world were not surprised by the outcome. But Shamrock ultimately proved to be incredibly valuable. I would go so far as saying the most valuable performer in the UFC in years. He, for one night, made UFC a hot ticket. It was the quality of the show that may keep UFC the hot ticket. Even though it was certainly not his intention, he passed the torch to make the new star bigger than he ever could have been, beating all the tougher current fighters they could line up for him. None of them could have cut the promos to get people into the fight. None had the name value to swell the audiences past the hardcores. And even if some would give Ortiz more of a run for their money, the only ones who would have cared were already buying the show. Even though the fight went 15 minutes before Shamrock told John McCarthy after the third round that he'd had enough, it looked over minutes before it started. Backstage, as Ortiz was warming up hitting the pads, it was clear his punching speed had improved greatly since his last fight. His Muay Thai training had taken hold, and he was fluid going from punches to kicks to knees. Shamrock's only shot at winning, since his chances to win via submission were overrated, was to be able to avoid the takedown and outslug Ortiz standing. Shamrock, who trimmed down to 201 pounds for the fight, looked in remarkable condition for a man of his age. But looks were deceiving. Ortiz had secluded himself for 3 months in the mountains of Big Bear, California, working with top wrestlers, kickboxers and jiu-jitsu specialists, including leglock experts like Scott Adams and Oleg Toktarov, to avoid what some thought would be Shamrock's strongest weapon, and he was clearly in the best shape of his career and totally confident. Those who had trained with Shamrock in Dallas really believed there was no way he would lose. The Lion's Den members were described as shocked and in deep depression when it became clear quickly he wasn't going to deliver. They got out there and traded. Ortiz was connecting and beating Shamrock badly to the punch, but there was a ray of hope as Shamrock did stun Ortiz early with a punch and put him down. He couldn't match Ortiz's hand speed and ferocity, but he did have more punching power. Ortiz tied him up and tried to throw Shamrock. He had trouble doing so, but finally took him down. From that point on, it was a squash. Ortiz pounded on Shamrock for the rest of the round, which wasn't nearly as disconcerting for Shamrock fans as the fact Shamrock had fear in his face and later, blood. Instead of moving and looking for an opening, he was gassing out quickly and just holding on for dear life. Ortiz spent the next 2 rounds doing textbook ground and pound, making hamburger meat out of Shamrock's face, which was developing more cuts, bruises and lumps with each passing second. Shamrock never even tried his much vaunted submission moves. He did manage a couple of nice escapes, which popped the crowd hoping for a competitive fight, but he was too tired to do anything when he was back on his feet. After the 3rd round, with swelling on his left eye growing to golf ball-sized proportions, he had enough. Ortiz, wanting to rub it in, grabbed and put on a t-shirt he had planned for the occasion, with it saying, "I just killed Kenny and you bastard." The crowd immediately turned on him and one of his trainers demanded he take it off. Shamrock went up to him and, like he did in the Fry fight after the two had pounded on each other after years of bad blood, Shamrock hugged Ortiz and congratulated him. He did the passing of the torch interview, making no excuses and just saying he got his butt whipped. Ortiz praised Shamrock as a pioneer, and then made a comment when asked about a match with Chuck Liddell, saying they'd better pay him more or the two would shop the match to Japan, presumably meaning Pride. Ortiz did wear that t-shirt at the post-fight press conference. Ortiz and Liddell have long-term UFC deals, but going to Pride won't be as simple as with most of the fighters. That last comment left a damper with company officials on what was otherwise a home run show, finally gaining redemption for the crippling show 14 months ago that put the company in its current hole. It was almost a perfect undercard, in that the main event drew the attention, but the undercard made stars, in particular Liddell, Robbie Lawler, Matt Hughes, and Carlos Newton, all of whom won first-round blowaways. It was the opposite from the infamous UFC 33, where every fight went the distance. While learning from the best of pro wrestling with the hype, video packages, big screens in the building and pyro, they also learned the worst. Midway through the show, Zuffa president Dana White and owner Lorenzo Fertitta got in the ring while announcer Bruce Buffer made an announcement. Would this be the elusive television deal that would give them a real shot at mainstream? No, it was the return of someone from the past. And just as people around the country were saying "Hoist Gracie" simultaneously, out came Tank Abbott. Probably the most stunned person of all was UFC matchmaker and VP of talent, Joe Silva, who hours earlier on radio was asked about Abbott coming back, and responded that it would never happen. Abbott got the monstrous pop one gets bringing back a charismatic former headliner, and he cut a promo talking about how the current group of fighters are all posers who bleach their hair, Presumably that was in reference to Ortiz, who started as an Abbott sparring partner. The two had a falling out when Ortiz started becoming a star, and it was made worse when UFC gave its poster boy Tank's old nickname, the Huntington Beach Bad Boy. The timing was a big deal, introducing him in front of the largest possible audience. It was no secret Pride had been interested in Abbott, and with Pride planning to debut in Las Vegas next year, this made him something of a valuable commodity. Dana White went to Los Angeles recently to have lunch with Abbott and talk business. Abbott privately said roughly the same interview he gave in the ring. Since deciding it was time to make a comeback, Abbott has dropped from more than 300 pounds to 250. He was asked to fight on the February 28th show and said that he wouldn't be ready, so it impressed White that he wasn't just coming back for a payday, and he didn't make the kind of monetary demands for a comeback that some of the other name fighters, most notably Frank Shamrock, have made. Abbott hasn't fought since October 16, 1998, when he was knocked out in Sao Paulo, Brazil by Hitso. Since then, he became one of pro wrestling's all-time most overpaid washouts in a failed WCW stint. It was thought he was tailor-made for Pride, with his outrageous personality and colorful style, where he could be matched up with pro wrestlers, as opposed to the real top-shelf fighters that make up the UFC ranks. Thus comes an interesting promotional decision. The return of Shamrock put the company on the mainstream map. Abbott, who wasn't even as successful a fighter as Shamrock in the old days, and while he would get as big or bigger pops, his record as a draw didn't even come close. Abbott was even more of a party animal than Shamrock, which takes its toll on fighters once they pass their early 30s. Still, he is a name, and like Shamrock, can talk a great fight, and does have tremendous punching power. Abbott would have been a far bigger draw as a title challenger for Rico Rodriguez's heavyweight title on the February 28th pay-per-view from Atlantic City than anyone in the organization. And it's not out of the question it won't happen even with Abbott wanting to delay his return. UFC has no other contenders ready. However, insiders would see that match, billed as a title fight, as a complete joke. But Shamrock made Ortiz bigger than he ever was, and turned him from an underground poster boy in one night to a prospective living legend. Rodriguez would get the same kind of a rub from destroying Abbott. It's the ultimate conflict between being in the entertainment business to draw money, and in the sports business to provide the best quality matchup. UFC was hoping for Ian Freeman to beat Andrei Arlovski, but that was a blow out in the other direction. Arlovski lost his 2 UFC fights, one of which was to Rodriguez, so it would be hard to give him a shot. Perhaps Vladimir Matyushenko or Gon McGee would be selected, but neither would create the buzz to get the show over the top like Abbott would. The most logical idea for Abbott to serve both masters would be a nostalgia match with Shamrock. The two had one of UFC's legendary grudges, but never actually had the match, as Shamrock signed with WWF just as UFC was attempting to put that match together. The big question is, after taking that beating, is Shamrock wanting to and willing to come back after his entire aura was destroyed? Shamrock's talks with UFC have included wanting to fight in the light heavyweight division against guys his own size. If he wants to come back, the name under consideration as his next opponent is Vitor Belfort, which is also not a good match for Shamrock. Fred Durst ended up not being there as advertised, but Bradshaw was there, shown on camera several times because he was in the front row going nuts at the fights, but never identified because I don't think anyone knew who he was, as the only Bradshaw they would have known was Terry. For the future, like with all sports entertainment franchises, the key is television. UFC has been working on a television deal, and it was well known that Fox Sports Net looked to be the most likely venue. Thus it came as a shock when minor league rival, the World Fighting Alliance, which had a show the next night in Las Vegas, announced a TV deal with FSN, starting on January 21st. It's only a 4-week tryout, and it will be airing tapes of both the 2 previously taped WFA shows from Las Vegas, and the 3rd show, which took place on November 23rd at the Aladdin Hotel. UFC officials say a deal is close, maybe even imminent, but WFA appears to be beating them to the punch. The only thing we heard is that show wasn't very good, with a crowd of 2,500. Fights weren't good. Ice-T played for 30 minutes before the first match, and that was a WCW-like mistake because the people who were there wanted to see fights. The lighting was said to be gray, which won't make for strong television. The main event was a disaster with fans hating it. Frank Trigg accidentally kicked Dennis Hallman low, and Hallman couldn't continue after a 5-minute recovery period. The match and their championship was then awarded to Trigg, when it should have been either a no contest or a disqualification. There was a lot of talk that UFC was talking with ESPN, which would include getting Max Kellerman aboard as an announcer. A year ago, UFC interviewed Mike Tenay for its lead announcing job, and decided against him, feeling he was too old, because they were looking for someone like Kellerman. The plan after Atlantic City at this point is to put together Ortiz vs. Liddell with a strong undercard in an attempt to duplicate this show's success at the MGM Grand Garden Arena in late April or early May, followed by a major summer show in Japan. Andrei Arlovski knocked out Ian Freeman in 1:18. Arlovski decked Freeman with a punch after setting him up with a low kick. He used another low kick to set Freeman up for a flurry of 4 rights that ended the fight. Phil Miller beat Mark Weir in 4:50 of the second round in the best fight of the show. This was back and forth action. In the first round, Weir went for a triangle, but Miller blocked it with a power bomb. Miller was on top and connected with a couple of good punches. Weir went for another triangle from the bottom, and was power bombed. Weir by this point had a bloody nose. Weir opened the second round rocking Miller's world with a left roundhouse kick. He went for a choke. Miller reversed, got on top and was pounding Weir. Weir escaped and it appeared Miller was gassing out and about to lose, when he turned the tables and got a choke. Vladimir Matyushenko beat Travis Wyeth in the first round, when Wyeth quit after taking a pounding. Wyeth looked like Brock Lesnar, but it wasn't enough, and came across overmatched. This was the only match that didn't eventually air on pay-per-view. 1. Robbie Lawler beat Tiki Gosen in 1:29. Gosen was setting Lawler up with leg kicks. Lawler countered with a right hand that put Gosen down. Lawler then threw a nasty punch at him on the ground and ref Nelson Hamilton made a flying tackle to stop the fight. It was hilarious, as this old guy looked like he was going for an Oklahoma side roll. Needless to say, he didn't get the move. Gosen had a nasty cut both above and below the left eye. In the delusional remark of the night, when Jeff Osborne after the fight asked Gosen if he still thought Lawler was overrated, as he'd been saying in pre-match hype, Gosen said, "It was a cut, they stopped it for a cut," not recognizing with him immovable on the ground and his head in a stationary position with a man with scary firepower about to hit a bullseye, that he should thank Triple H for the fight being stopped. 2. Carlos Newton beat Pete Spratt in 1:45 with a Kimura, entangled armlock made famous in the 50s by former Japanese pro wrestling star Masahiko Kimura. Newton took Spratt right down and it was clear his skill on the ground was far superior. After the match, when Newton was asked about wanting a title shot, he said he was still young, he's 26, and wanted to bide his time. Translated, it means he would want a title shot, but not against this champion Matt Hughes. He may have a long wait ahead of him. Looks like a Newton vs. Hayato Sakurai match may be in the offing. 3. Matt Hughes retained the welterweight title over Gil Castillo in 5 minutes via doctor stoppage. Hughes took Castillo down right away with the belly-to-belly. He did the ground and pound, and cut Castillo over the right eye. The cut itself was opened by an accidental headbutt. When the round was over, Dr. Margaret Goodman was checking on Castillo's eye when Castillo told her that he couldn't see out of the eye. She immediately stopped the fight. This caused major controversy because Rogan, not knowing that Castillo couldn't see, went off on it being a premature stoppage. Then again, so did I, also not knowing that same info. There should be a provision that if a match is stopped due to a cut, and the cut is caused by a foul, that the match be a no contest, because even though not intentional, you ended up having 3 matches in 2 nights, the WFA main event the next night in Las Vegas and the Takata Tamura match, one because a guy committed a foul. 4. Chuck Liddell retained his number 1 contender status in the light heavyweight division over Renato Babalu Sobral in 2:59 via knockout. Liddell was throwing punches while Babalu was doing leg kicks. Liddell put him down with a left foot, shin catching face, and it was over. Liddell after the match said he wanted the winner of Shamrock vs. Ortiz. Liddell was limping pretty badly the next day from those leg kicks. 5. Ortiz beat Shamrock in 5 minutes of the third round to retain the light heavyweight title. Those lives said Shamrock got the biggest pop coming out of anyone in UFC history. Very vocal crowd with each having their support and loud chants for both guys, but it quickly became a pro-Ortiz crowd as he dominated. He was quicker on the draw, but Ortiz did again show his vulnerability as he was knocked down quickly early. Ortiz recovered immediately and Shamrock couldn't take any advantage of the situation. Ortiz took him down after a bit of a struggle, with Shamrock initially showing good balance. Ortiz pounded on him, and cut him over the right eye. Shamrock seemed blown up and demoralized quickly. Second round saw Ortiz waste no time in taking him down. Ortiz threw elbows and forearms to the head, tried a forearm choke, knees to the side, more elbows. Shamrock got up and got a huge pop, but couldn't do anything on his feet. Third round saw them trade, with Ortiz looking like he was going to take Shamrock apart as he was rocking him with blows, but Shamrock actually was never even knocked down. He took Shamrock down. Shamrock's left eye was swelling badly by this point. Shamrock got up again at the end of the round, but went to McCarthy and said that was it. Linda McMahon faced the most critical response from investors to date as she tried to put as positive a spin as possible on the company's first money-losing quarter, with the exception of the first quarter of 2001, which was due to the XFL, since 1997. For the period from August through October, the company lost $1,604,000, although the wrestling side itself is actually far healthier than that indicates. The losses were due to $5.9 million taken over the quarter of the $13 million in total for a legal settlement on a breach of contract issue with the William Morris Agency. In addition, there was another $918,000 in losses on investments and an estimated $2 million in losses from operation of the World Complex. In a sense, even though the previous quarter showed a $2,528,000 profit, looking at things deeper, this quarter was more successful because much of that was due to the out-of-court favorable settlement in the PTC lawsuit, without which the profit would have only been $328,000. The wrestling side in other ways looks deceivingly good because this quarter includes a $3 million live gate from the Global Warning Show in Melbourne, Australia, as well as a relatively successful, by today's standards, SummerSlam pay-per-view event, which is figured as doing about 450,000 buys for the well-built-up Rock vs. Brock Lesnar match, as well as a strong European tour, while the usual going rate for pay-per-view shows aside from the big ones has dropped below 300,000 buys. Survivor Series, based on early returns, looks to have done well above the level of the other recent shows, but not close to SummerSlam levels. In total revenues for the 3-month period, the company grossed $92,768,000, up from $88,147,000 over the previous 3 months. These are still figures out of the stratosphere of any wrestling company in history aside from the hot period of WWF. Last year the company grossed $98,208,000 over the same 3-month period. McMahon said the company considers television ratings as the key drivers of its business, and once again felt that the declines are leveling off, noting SmackDown starting to show increases. She blamed the declines on the fact that males 17 to 34 are watching less television, and predicted an increase in the Raw ratings as they build to the 10th anniversary special, which is scheduled for January 14th. The special will be surprising not take place in the show's normal time slot, but be a Tuesday night special on TNN. It will be a collection of the best clips in the history of the show, which is rumored to be from the world in New York. The regular Raw show that week will be taped at the Mohegan Sun Casino in Uncasville, Connecticut, and SmackDown for that week will be taped on January 12th, a Sunday night, at the Continental Airlines Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Historically, wrestling TV shows playing on history themes have not done well in the ratings, and WWE's recent attempt at a Tuesday night special on UPN, which admittedly wasn't nearly as well promoted as this will be, was a huge disappointment. She noted they would be building toward that show for weeks, and at their Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade float it would be largely promoting that fact. She claimed no other television series had such longevity. Evidently Raw is a television series and Monday Night Football is not. She talked about SummerSlam selling out Nassau Coliseum in 90 minutes and SummerSlam setting an MSG record gross. Total live event revenue was up 12% from the same quarter last year to $18.1 million. Like last quarter, that's due to almost doubling the number of events and higher ticket prices. Last year during this period they averaged 8,582 fans per show, 472,000 fans, in 55 events. This year that figure dropped to 458,000 fans on 90 events, or 5,089 per event. But that figure is skewed greatly by the British tour and the Australia show. For domestic shows, the average attendance the past 3 months was 4,598 and average gate was $162,230. That's a significant drop from $5,702 and $206,127 for the months from May through July. Of the company's $18.1 million in live ticket sales, $4.25 million, or 23.5%, came from 3 international shows. Average domestic ticket price compared with the previous quarter dropped from $36.15 to $35.30. Pay-per-view revenues for the quarter were estimated at $19.0 million, down from $22.2 million, even though the price per event rose from $29.95 to $34.95. Due to SummerSlam, pay-per-view is up over the previous quarter to 1,025,000 estimated buys, about 450,000 for SummerSlam with Rock vs. Lesnar and about 283,000 each for Unforgiven, Lesnar vs. Undertaker, and No Mercy, Lesnar vs. Undertaker. The buy rates would be about 0.87 for SummerSlam and 0.54 for the latter two shows, the lowest WWE pay-per-view buy rates since February 1998. Realistically, things aren't dropping since Judgment Day. King of the Ring and Vengeance also all did about 283,000 buys per show. Television rights fees were listed at $13.8 million for the quarter, with the increase being not because of wrestling, but because of the company's advance cut for leasing out Rock for the movie El Dorado. They were $12.9 million last quarter, but that was also higher because of a rights fee paid by TNN for the Divas Undressed special. Television ad revenue was $19.7 million, which was actually up from $16.7 million the previous quarter, even with declining ratings, largely because advertising itself is making a comeback. Total merchandise revenue was $22.1 million. Books and toys were down compared to last year, while record sales were up due to the success of Forcible Entry. Licensing was up to $5.2 million from $3.2 million last quarter, but a huge drop from $9.2 million last year at this time. More merchandise was sold at arenas this year than last year due to almost double the number of shows. Per caps are much higher because the hardcore fans who spend money on merchandise still go, but casual fans who buy little merchandise no longer attend. Merchandise sold through their website and catalogs were down, but merchandise dropped from $6.3 million last quarter to $5.3 million, which is pretty significant. The company averages $44,400 in merchandise revenue per house show, down from $50,919 over the summer, and that's misleadingly high because it includes the Australia show. Including the overseas shows, they did $8.73 per head in merchandise sales, as compared to $8.93 the previous quarter. Publishing revenue for the quarter was $3.9 million, down from $4.0 million the prior quarter. That included an increase in price of Raw magazine. However, home videos are up significantly, from $3.5 million last quarter and $3.3 million last year, to $4.5 million, largely due to the popularity of DVDs, which now make up 72% of units sold as compared to 31% last year. Revenues at the World, which were $2.6 million in this quarter last year, and that reflects the period that includes 50 days after the September 11th catastrophe, and $2.3 million last quarter, were down to $2 million this quarter. The company currently has $445.7 million in total assets, which is down from $487.4 million at this point last year. It has $84.6 million in current liabilities, and its cash and cash equivalents as well as short-term investment income is $263.9 million. She noted the heat on the brand extension, saying they expected from the start it to take 12 to 18 months to get solidified. We are 8 months in right now. She claimed they were still within the projected timetable but admitted everyone wanted to get it going quicker. She said the brand extension is what opened the door to creating new talent, and once again credited Lesnar becoming a top star to the brand extension, an assertion that is ridiculous. Running with the same crew on both television shows earlier this year, they had Austin, Rock, Flair, Hogan, Triple H, Angle, Undertaker and Vince as legitimate ratings draws, and Hall and Nash were both put in that strong position as well, even though they were largely riding on Hogan's coattails, if they meant anything. Today, with more TV time opened up to develop new talent, they have lost Austin, Rock, Hogan, Hall, Nash, and while they're still with the company, they've also lost Flair and Vince as ratings draws. Triple H and Angle's drawing power has lessened. Undertaker's was probably overrated to begin with, but they always kept him strong. Eric Bischoff, as great a performer as he is not a ratings draw as the heel general manager role has run its course. The only newcomer they've allowed to crack that plane is Lesnar, and their brought back Michaels put Show in a top position, and McMahon mentioned Scott Steiner as one of the current Big Four, Michaels, Triple H and Lesnar. The other argument for the brand extension she talked about was it allows international touring, which going forward will become more and more important to the company. But that's a fallacy as well. They could run split crews, which they did long before the extension at house shows and were drawing significantly better at the time on pay-per-view and arena dates as well as TV ratings. On previous international tours before the extension, they often ran a second crew on house shows in the US. You could still send half the crew abroad and they're just doing their house shows for the week in India, instead of domestically, exactly what they are doing now. There are positives for a brand extension. One would be the ability to split up merchandise and licensing, which they gave up when they called both groups WWE and have made no attempt to do such a thing. It would allow two separate styles to be presented on television, which they are doing, except one of the styles is failing and they haven't fully come to grips with it, so that's not a positive. They could build a super angle for down the road, which there is no indication they've got any plans for and haven't allowed the audience to suspend disbelief on the angle to where anyone would care. It does open space for new stars to develop, but when booking cuts them off, it's been the biggest failure of all. Among other items talked about at the conference is that they expect their first project from the WWE Films division to be released in the fall of 2003. She noted that there will be interactive fans voting for the live finals of Tough Enough 3. When called on the carpet about the world, even with the suggestion of how long they can keep going before they cut bait, McMahon admitted they've made mistakes by not doing what they originally planned with the complex. It was a strategic move to remove WWE from the title, because of the idea that it typecast the place and they wanted it as a major entertainment complex. But that turned into a failure. Now, they are going to rebrand it the World of WWE, and will make changes such as bringing more talent in for live appearances, in particular injured and retired wrestlers, and setting up games such as the ones they use as fan access, such as giving fans the ability to call matches. They should take this as open tryouts because it's hard for me to believe there aren't people out there who can call matches far better than some of the newer people they've put in that role of late. Next year, they're going to rename the restaurant part of the complex Junior's Barbecue and Grill and push the infamous Junior's barbecue sauce. She was also called on the carpet about creative by a very critical investor who was clearly a hardcore fan, who cited many house shows drawing less than 2,000 fans and the recent Philadelphia house show that may have drawn the lowest attendance for a Philly show in decades. He actually blamed Triple H and noted he was Linda's daughter's boyfriend, said they had created no successful storylines, said they just tried a necrophilia storyline which was a flop, that the television is repetitive and every women's match looks the same, and saying the bad creative was the crux of the problems with the company. This was the most critical question regarding the product they've ever gotten. It's not the kind of question, particularly bringing up the necrophilia angle, that I'm sure they wanted. McMahon defended Triple H, saying while she was Stephanie's boyfriend, she was his new boyfriend, indicating it was something recent and not something that dated back 2.5 years, and he was a star long before the relationship and his push isn't related to that. She also said they were working on new women's storylines and pointed out the new character they've created for Victoria as well as the creation of the Elimination Chamber as a fresh idea that will enable them to sell Elimination Chamber toys. It was here that she mentioned Triple H as being one of the big four with Lesnar, Steiner, and Michaels. The investor fired back, saying that Michaels is done, that Steiner is just another WCW retread, and that they need to create new stars. He retorted while the company financially is better off than WCW at the end because they are better business people, that creatively they are like WCW at the end, pointed out the attendance and the brand extension idea as the problems. We are not WCW, McMahon responded, and pointed to Edge and Test as new stars they are trying to create. She noted that some stars, like Michaels, take years to create, while others, like Rock, got there faster. When asked about Steve Austin, she portrayed Austin as a good friend of ours that they've talked with several times, but said she didn't know if he's coming back. Austin made a public appearance later that same day in Richmond, Virginia, and when asked by just about everyone that same question, said the company has been trying to get him to come back in January, and for WrestleMania at the latest, but he hasn't decided to come back yet. In a media interview when he made his court appearance a few days later, Austin talked about wanting to get things squared away on the home front first, but said he wanted to resurrect his wrestling career, citing that when he saw 5,000 people come to see him at his public appearance, he thinks he still has drawing power left. Jim Ross did a radio interview the next day where he said that he talks to Austin all the time and said he expected him back at some point. The company also admitted that due to the decline in ratings, they've had to do make goods on advertising. That really isn't all that unusual in television, and they've been doing so actually for a long time. In what ultimately will be the most important dates as people looking ahead historically in wrestling are aware, she noted that the UPN contract expires in August of 2003 and the contract with Viacom over the TNN and MTV properties, Raw, Heat, and the Saturday Night Block, expires in September 2005. When asked about previous historical down periods and how quickly they turned around, McMahon said the last down period was 1997 to 1998, citing ratings as the only barometer as those were actually years business started turning around, and 18 months later they peaked stronger than ever historically. The actual last major down period for WWE business started after WrestleMania in 1992, and it was nearly 6 years later, early 1998. With the ascension of Steve Austin and introduction of Mike Tyson before the company had solidly rebounded from it. Linda McMahon ended the same conference by talking extensively about the company's problems with the Worldwide Fund for Nature, World Wildlife Fund. She said that when they bought the company from Vince McMahon Sr. and his partners in 1982, They trademarked the WWF name and logo, and the only parties who had any problem with it was Wake Forest University, which had a similar logo. They made an agreement to never sell merchandise on the campus of Wake Forest in exchange for the university dropping its claim. When the fund sought an injunction in 1994 that would have banned the wrestling company from using the initials any longer, they reached the noted agreement that would prohibit them marketing as WWF outside of North America. Based on European law, if the wrestling company had never signed the agreement, they probably could have coexisted in the marketplace because they are entirely different companies. It is that agreement, which the company reneged on, that led to the recent legal problems, largely over the company not dropping the internet identity of WWF.com, that caused the lawsuit which resulted in the wrestling company changing to WWE. Part of the legal action, besides demanding the wrestling company dropping the WWF name, was claiming damages. The fund recently came up with a figure of $360 million as its claimed damages from the wrestling company violating the agreement. It is not known how they came up with the figure, but obviously WWE is claiming the figure should be $0. As part of the agreement earlier this year, WWE would have until November 10th to phase out sales of any merchandise or releasing footage with the WWF name on it, in particular in Europe. This led to them having to stop sales of any pre-name change videotapes in England. There are plans to remarket some of those tapes but with the WWF references removed, and replace the WWF Classics TV show with old tapes from WCW. The two sides were in negotiations for a deadline extension, and McMahon claimed they had agreed to extend the deadline until February 10th. She said that 2 weeks ago, Michael Rogers, the fund's lawyer who they were negotiating with, sent them a letter saying it would extend the deadline until February 10th and drop the rest of the lawsuit. WWE made an out-of-court settlement of $90 million. When WWE refused, Rogers and the fund are beginning to take legal action to remove from the marketplace several video games produced prior to the name change. WWE countered in a statement claiming, "The fund is using a United Kingdom court to block the sale of WWE video games for Christmas, a Grinch-like move to deny wrestling fans around the world the opportunity to receive these products as Christmas gifts." The company, using their usual tactics of trying to confuse the issues and making it a personal battle, then released a second press release going after Rogers, saying he resides in Switzerland, where the fund is headquartered, but has no Swiss license to practice law. He has an English license and the case was heard in court in England. WWE attorney Jerry McDevitt called the $90 million request nothing more than a shakedown, and said it's absurd to believe the wrestling company financially damaged the fund or that there was confusion in the marketplace. McDevitt noted that the fund had made a demand of Nintendo reps in Germany because they were advertising and selling video games under the WWF logo and banner after the name change, while telling Nintendo they would drop their claim if they became a substantial financial sponsor of the fund. McDevitt also said that fund supporters don't realize that the fund has negotiated in the past to use the WWF trademark for products such as alcohol, tobacco and animal skins. McDevitt also said that Rogers' past included involvement in business affairs of famed mutual fund swindlers Robert Vesco and Bernie Cornfield, and even tried to tie his 80s involvement in establishing an Islamic charity Dar al-Mal al-Islam to the September 11th tragedies because it was named in lawsuits after the event as a vehicle used to funnel Saudi money to fund the al-Qaeda terrorists. THQ and Yakks Pacific issued their own press release later in the week saying that all products currently on shelves with the WWF logo that were shipped to retail prior to November 10th are not subject to recall. However, Justice Robin Jacob in London, who is presiding over the WWF versus WWE lawsuit, ruled on November 26 that THQ would be in contempt of court if it continued to sell any wrestling video game that contained a WWF logo now that the November 10th deadline has passed in the UK, forcing removal of video games from store shelves. In a statement that is very scary, since he's presiding over the damages case and his statements on the case have consistently been strongly anti-WWE, Jacob said that THQ should bill WWE for all the merchandise removal and subsidize them for any revenue lost. In an article in Reuters, Jacob said, "It seems to me that THQ must look to the Federation, WWE, for the losses which have been caused. It was the Federation that got them into this mess." McMahon noted that they considered, but ended up not doing it, an angle at the Rebellion pay-per-view in Manchester on October 26 where Vince would be challenged and come out and pin a wrestler in a panda costume. Considering they had a pending case for damages, doing that angle would have been one of the stupidest possible things they could have done. The Pride pay-per-view on November 24 from the sold-out Tokyo Dome that aired on the same day in both the US and Japan turned out to be two totally different shows, one for each audience. The Japanese show was advertised and built up as the retirement of Nobuiko Takata and the final chapter of the UWFI, A cult pro wrestling promotion? Think of ECW, only if at its peak it was doing a 6.6 TV rating and 46,000 fans to its biggest show, and if its biggest star was considered a major sports celebrity. The ads on television, playing the distinctive UWFI theme song, were built around Takata facing the wrestler who, as the promotion was closing, was about to surpass him as king of the worked shoot inside the ring, Kyoshi Tamura. UWFI was a one-time hit on American pay-per-view in 1993. The debut show, built around the concept of it being shoot fighting, a real version of pro wrestling, drew 95,000 buys. But Americans were never going to embrace a fighting sport, worked or otherwise, and this wasn't otherwise, that didn't allow closed fist punches to the head, the entire basis of fighting in the American mind, from boxing and fiery comebacks in pro wrestling. UFC debuted at the same time to slightly lesser numbers, but provided more reality, and ended up as the franchise with the staying power. UWFI aired a few more times on pay-per-view in the US, doing very little business and making no impact. The symbolic end of UWFI means nothing in the United States. Pride has banned the term pro wrestling from its broadcasts, and no, Kevin Dunn is not the producer, which becomes almost completely absurd when on its August show, they had Bill Goldberg on commentary and pushed him as a famous ex-NFL star, and this show was built around an old wrestling promotion on a show filled with pro wrestlers, whose backgrounds were never talked about. On the American version of the show, not only did the key part of the show to Japanese fans, the retirement ceremony and symbolic end of UWFI, not air, but the Takata vs. Tamura match, due to time constraints, the Japanese pay-per-view lasted 5.5 hours, was edited off the show. The show also showcased how in Japan, once you are a huge star, you will always be a huge star. Takata was the most important person in the formation of the Pride promotion, a company originally formed to promote a Takata vs. Hicks and Gracie match on October 11, 1997 at the Tokyo Dome. At that point in time, because of UWFI, there were tons of fans in Japan who believed Takata was actually the best fighter in the world. The early Pride shows, a mix of worked and shoot matches, usually built around people in pro wrestling, were dreadful. Takata himself never won a match that wasn't bought and paid for in advance, a streak that continued with his final match. It would have been one thing had he lost exciting matches, but most of his bouts were terrible. He did nothing at all in his biggest matches in Pride, his 2 bouts with Hicks and Gracie, a terrible match with Hoist Gracie, and 2 of the worst performances possible in matches with K1 stars Mirko Cro Cop and Mike Bernardo. The latter 2 were Takata's delathons. In fairness, Bernardo seemed even more afraid of Takata than Takata seemed of him, that contained almost no action and went to draws where the crowd booed him out of the building. But he was still the guy who 8 years ago beat Vader with an armbar in the famous UWFI World Champion vs. WCW World Champion showdown that sold out Jingu Stadium in Tokyo. The show drew 52,228 fans, the 3rd largest crowd for an MMA event in history. It was an amazing total for a show that had neither a huge grudge match or dream match that the casual fans would be into, and was promoted around nostalgia, for a promotion that went out of business 6 years ago. It was a good show, and with the biggest video wall I've ever seen, picture it Titantron ×5. The production values remained state-of-the-art. But it did not have anywhere close to the atmosphere or excitement of the UFC show 2 days earlier. The show had its high and low points. For Japanese fans, the biggest thing coming out of the show was the second step in making the next big thing, 1992 Olympic judo gold medalist Hitohiko Yoshida. Yoshida did something thought to be unimaginable in anyone's wildest dreams in beating Don Frye quickly with an armbar. It was among the biggest upsets in MMA history, since it was Yoshida's first match under MMA rules. His August Pride debut win over Hoist Gracie was a match that didn't allow striking to the face, and Frye had only lost once in his career that dated back 7 years and included some of the most legendary matches in MMA history. Those who didn't see it immediately began proclaiming that it must have been a work, that the angle Yoshida put Frye's arm in, a sickening position, is something that would seem to contradict that notion. It had no holes and the intensity was there. Frye never punched Yoshida in the face, but he also was in no position to do so. Wearing a gi into the ring, and with Yoshida's experience, if he can get the thing into a judo style, like he has in his last 2 fights, with his balance and skill, he's going to be just about unbeatable. And if he can't, he's Saul. Someone with a gold medal, as well as consecutive wins over Gracie and Frye, should be a national hero and a huge draw in Japan. Time will tell, because Yoshida lacks charisma. They seem to be grooming Yoshida for either Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira or Wanderlei Silva, perhaps more for Silva, who is the bigger draw of the 2, for a big stadium show in the spring. The show also ended up with several other prospective opponents for Silva in Ricardo Arona, which would be a Brazilian grudge match, Kevin Randleman, as well as Japanese pro wrestler Hitohiko Yoshida. Arona may be the most well-rounded and deserving, but he ended up suffering a broken orbital bone around his left eye in his win and was hospitalized after the fight. But Yoshida would be the one who would sell the most tickets. Promoter Naoto Morishita was talking about February for a major show with Nogueira vs Yoshida and Silva vs Sakuraba 3, although the latter match at this point is a bad idea. The show also set up Russian Fedor Yenico, who gave Heath Herring the beating of his life, as a very legitimate threat to Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira's status as the best heavyweight in the world. It was announced on the American pay-per-view that the two would face each other in a title match on the next Pride, which will be billed as Cold Fury 3. The show takes place on December 23 at the Fukuoka International Center Arena, but won't be airing in North America until January 11. The high point in a sense for old UWFI fans was the ending, as the protege Tamura reluctantly knocked out his hero, a scene reminiscent of Larry Holmes having to beat Muhammad Ali and brought the dome crowd to a hush, followed by a retirement ceremony from Takata which included most of the original UWFI stars like Takayama, Hiromitsu Kanehara, Kazushi Sakuraba, Yoji Anju, Yuko Miyato, and Kenichi Yamamoto, as well as Antonio Inoki. For the more casual Japanese pro wrestling fans who watch Pride, but were newer fans who didn't experience UWFI, the show wasn't judged nearly as positively. The bad part of the show was the final match, where Sakuraba beat Gilles Arsène of France. It was clear Arsène had nothing to offer, as he largely curled up in a ball. Sakuraba, who had no business fighting on this night, came across looking terribly weak, because he couldn't finish him. Sakuraba limped to the ring with his right knee heavily taped. It was kept a secret, but he suffered torn ligaments in the knee just before the match and kept it quiet until after the match. He was very limited in what he could do, but was facing someone who couldn't give him any trouble. There were a lot of people afterwards, and it was even discussed on television with ref Yuji Shimada, that he should have stopped the fight when Arsène tried nothing. It was clear Sakuraba was going out of his way not to hurt him when Arsène left himself wide open. As Shimada called it earlier, it wouldn't have been boring or come off nearly as bad. In a major short-term blow, Semi Schilt was announced as having a tendon injury in his left shoulder from the triangle finisher from Nogueira, and it will force him to miss the K1 Grand Prix on December 7 at the Tokyo Dome with the much-talked-about Battle of the Giants against Bob Sapp. Sapp will now face Ernesto Hoost in a rematch of their October 5 bout at the Saitama Super Arena, which Sapp won via ref stoppage at the end of the first round. 1. Hirotaka Yokoi, 01 pro wrestler who had a shoot background from rings, defeated Gerald Venetian, K1 champion from Holland, in 13:20 to improve his record to 10-0. Only the second round aired on US pay-per-view. Yokoi dominated the match, getting an early takedown in dominant position and threw a lot of punches from the mount in the first round. Second round saw Yokoi again take him down immediately. He went for one armbar, but failed. Yokoi still controlled him on the ground and on his second try, completed the armbar for the tap out. 2. Kevin Randleman defeated former UWFI pro wrestler Kenichi Yamamoto in 16-16. Before the match, Randleman challenged Silva to a title match but put Silva over as the best fighter in the world, and then made some comments about Tito Ortiz not being of that caliber which were bleeped out because he used naughty language. Randleman took Yamamoto down right away and went for a key lock, but never had the right technique. Yamamoto got up at one point, but Randleman quickly decked him with a left hook. Randleman totally controlled him in the second round with punches from the top and knees to the head and body. Yamamoto ended the round with a bloody nose and a messed up face. The two were blowing kisses at each other between rounds. Randleman took him right down in round 3 and started delivering 70s pro wrestling style double knee drops to the head, and the referee stopped it. Randleman on the ground sprung up to an almost vertical position and then came down with both knees to the head. 3. Ricardo Arona defeated Murilo Ninja, Murilo Rua, via unanimous decision after 20 minutes in a Brazilian grudge match. This was the second Pride meeting between the Brazilian top team of Rio de Janeiro, Arona, and the Shootbox Academy of Curitiba, who have one of those real-life feuds. Shootbox had bragging rights when Ninja wore out Mario Sperry earlier this year. This was a tremendous battle between two very skilled and exceedingly well-conditioned foes. Both were going all out and neither blew up. Arona was the stronger wrestler, which ended up making all the difference in pulling out an upset. This gives Arona consecutive wins over Guy Mesger, Dan Henderson, and Ninja. In 20s terminology, Ninja was something of the policeman for Silva, from the same gym, in knocking off contenders. Ninja went for a high knee at the bell and was almost power slammed to the mat. Not a good idea. Arona was on top the majority of the time. At one point he actually got a yellow card for stalling, which seemed surprising. Late in the first round, Ninja threw a good kick and punch, but Arona came back and took him down. Arona was very close to a heel hook submission when the first round ended. Second round saw Arona take him down. He went for a guillotine at one point. Ninja used that to reverse positions. Third round saw Arona deliver a kick to the face, and pretty much dominated the match through superior wrestling. 4. Fedor Emelianenko beat Heath Herring when it was stopped due to blood in 10 minutes in a match to determine the number 1 contender for Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. This was the match that made Fedor a star. He overpowered Herring with his wrestling, and was very aggressive, getting behind Herring and pulverizing his face with his heavy hands. Herring's face was busted up quickly. At one point, he tried to escape out of the ring, and was given a yellow card. His left eye looked like hell quickly. The doctor stopped the fight to check him, but allowed it to continue. Fedor took Herring down with a back suplex and pounded his face with more heavy blows. Herring was bleeding all over the place. Near the end of the round, Fedor went for a choke, which gave Herring an escape. Herring reversed it and went wild himself over the last minute, throwing hard punches and knees. However, between rounds, when the doctor looked at his face, he stopped the fight. Herring ended up hospitalized with a broken orbital bone around his left eye. 5. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira defeated his second straight giant, this time 7-foot Semi Schilt, in 6:36 of a non-title match. Crowd went nuts for Nogueira. The SAP match took him from being a fighter that everyone knew was good, and was beating everyone, to a star of the next magnitude. Schilt's takedown defense has improved greatly and Schlitt managed to make things uncomfortable early. But Nogueira got the takedown at 2:02. Once they were on the ground, it was the Nogueira show. He did a great finisher, as he baited Schilt by going for an armbar, and when Schlitt moved to escape, that's when he went for his trusty triangle. Schilt tried to powerbomb his way out, but couldn't break the hold and had to tap. Schlitt had some swelling under his left eye, but didn't seem to be hurt to where it would hamper him greatly for the K1 Grand Prix in 2 weeks. 6. Wanderlei Silva retained the middleweight title over Hiromitsu Kanehara in 3:31. This was an all-action short fight. Silva looked physically both smaller and softer, and far less intimidating than usual. In this case, looks were terribly deceiving. Kanehara tried to make it entertaining in trade. Silva put him down quickly with a left high kick. Silva put him down a second time with a left hook and tried a football kick, but Kanehara moved his head. Silva took him down and pounced on him again, then got up and threw a football kick which didn't miss, followed by a stomp on the head and Kanehara's corner throw in the towel. 7. Hitohiko Yoshida beat Don Frye in 5:32. Frye did an interview mocking Shawn Michaels before the fight. He said that he had retired and was home with his family. He said he'd like to say God told him to return to the ring, but really his family was sick of him being at home and wanted him out of the house. His sense of humor didn't help him. Frye tried to box, but Yoshida tied him up and leg tripped him. Yoshida got his back and tried to choke him with his gi. Frye escaped, got the top, and started throwing some body punches. Yoshida made a quick move and got the armbar, and in using the gi to trap him, there was no way for Frye to slip out. Yoshida bent Frye's arm in a terrible position. It was clear that, like in the Shamrock Right, Frye was going to get injured rather than admit defeat. His arm was bent far too far for far too long and the ref finally stopped it. Frye was hospitalized after the match for a possible broken elbow. 8. Kyoshi Tamura beat Nobuiko Takata in 11 minutes. This slowed down the show after 5 straight fast-paced good matches. Tamura kept throwing leg kicks in the first round, bruising Takata's leg badly. Tamura accidentally kicked Takata low, and Takata took his entire 5 minutes to delay. They ended on the ground with Tamura on top in the guard. In the second round, Tamura came out throwing leg kicks. Takata fired back and they traded. Tamura knocked Takata flat out with a right hook that brought a hush over the crowd. It was actually quite a scene as Tamura started crying in the ring at knocking out his mentor. It was said to be an incredible moment for the older fans as the end of Takata and Takata passing the torch to Tamura, his former number 2 guy. For those who weren't UWFI fans, they didn't really understand what was going on and found it boring. I wish this aired, if only because I'd love to see how they tried to explain all this without saying pro wrestling. 9. Kazushi Sakuraba beat Gilles Arsène in 17:08. Sakuraba came out with a tiger mask on. More importantly, he was limping badly. Sakuraba hit Arsène with a flurry of arm punches, but without any power in his right leg. His punches didn't have the usual power. Arsene had no defense, and went down. Sakuraba was on top, toying with him. Sakuraba kept slapping him around, but really not doing a lot. It was so weird watching a fighter in there with an overmatched guy and trying not to hurt him. Fans started leaving during this match because it was getting late and this was a terrible match. In the second round, Sakuraba opened again by throwing a flurry of punches. He then slapped him around. Finally, midway through round 2, Sakuraba decided to actually throw hard punches to the face. Arsene was defenseless and taking them, but the ref didn't stop it. The third round was more of the same, with Arsene wide open for punches, submissions, or anything, and Sakuraba not doing anything to him. He finally decided it would be an embarrassment to go the distance, so started throwing a few real punches, cutting Arsene up, and then got him in an armbar for a tap. Sunharu Thunder Sugiyama, who had both a lucrative and tragic life after being a top wrestling star during a television boom period, passed away on November 22 at his home in Nagoya from complications from the diabetes that had plagued his recent life. Sugiyama was 62. His career highlights included wrestling in the 1964 Olympics, and a few years later, was recognized by the No. 2 promotion in Japan as World Heavyweight Champion after a famous win over Billy Robinson. Sugiyama had gotten some mainstream publicity in recent years, both for his success, owning 6 successful companies that made him a multimillionaire, and for his health problems. His businesses, which included what is known as the culture as love hotels, where you rent rooms by the hour instead of by the night for Quickies, a company that supplied food and other products for numerous restaurants, and a company that got janitorial contracts at corporate business offices, supposedly generated $3.5 million in annual profits. In 1999, due to the diabetes that eventually took his life, had part of both his arms and both his legs amputated. He had several news features talking about the former TV wrestling star and showing him working at his office as an amputee. Sugiyama, at 5'8" and close to 275 pounds, was a short powerhouse of a wrestler, built and styled like a shorter version of Bam Bam Bigelow. He was born on July 23, 1940 in Itoigawa, near Niigata. When he was in college, Shohei Baba became something of the local sports hero as he began to make his mark as a huge wrestling star in the United States, at a time when a Japanese athlete making it big in the US was a rarity. He started amateur wrestling after growing up with a judo background, and became proficient at it quickly. He attended Meiji College in Tokyo at the same time as Masanori Saito and Seiji Sakaguchi. He was both national collegiate champion as a heavyweight and the all-around national champion in 1963, and went to the Tokyo Olympics in 1964 as a Greco-Roman heavyweight, during the heyday of such legendary Greco heavyweights as 320-pound István Kosma of Hungary, Anatoly Roshin of the Soviet Union, and German Wilfried Dietrich. Saito represented Japan in freestyle in those same Olympics. Both placed 7th in their respective divisions, becoming the first Japanese heavyweights in history ever to place an Olympic wrestling competition. It was a natural that after doing well in the most publicized Olympics ever for the Japanese people, that from the notoriety that both he and Saito would be recruited into pro wrestling. Both started under the tutelage of Hiro Matsuda, and in their early years, wrestled both in Japan and Florida. Saito became one of the most enduring Japanese pro wrestling stars ever. They started out together with a Tokyo Pro Wrestling promotion in 1965. The company was the first attempt at major competition for the established Japanese Wrestling Alliance, pulling from the established group Toyonobori, who had been the top star in the promotion during a down period and lost his spot to Baba, as well as Baba's other big internal rival as the group's top young star, Antonio Inoki. Sugiyama had his first match on March 4, 1966. With that company in financial trouble, he left with Matsuda to Florida, where he formed a tag team with the Great Kusatsu, whose son is now a well-known K1 fighter as Great Kusatsu Jr. Matsuda and Isao Yoshihara, with help from Toronto promoter Frank Tunney and Booker Great Togo, formed the first version of the International Wrestling Enterprises promotion, which included such names as Luthez, Danny Hodge, the Fabulous Kangaroos, and Toyonobori. He was quickly promoted as the top star of the group. But it was a time, with the more popular and dominant Japan Wrestling Alliance doing huge business with the Baba and Inoki team, that Japan was built around native tag teams. Iwai's main events usually included Sugiyama and Toyonobori, and their TV show had network coverage on TBS in Japan, including drawing a 26 rating for a live show headlined by Thez. It built up for a match on February 24, 1968 in Osaka, where the two defeated the Kangaroos, Al Costello and Don Kent, who were at the time considered the most famous tag team in the world, to win what was billed as the Trans World Wrestling Alliance World Tag Team titles. Sugiyama, coming from his Greco-Roman background, actually predated Jumbo Tsuruta as the first Japanese native who was a master of various suplexes, including what is now known as the German suplex. He used the running sit-down splash made famous in the US as the Earthquake Splash by John Tenta as his finisher. That Eway quickly folded when money ran out, leaving a lot of wrestlers not getting paid. The second Eway was formed later that year by Yoshihara, with Sugiyama and Toyonobori's belts recognized once again, and they had a famous 26-match winning streak in title matches before Rusher Kimura replaced the retiring Toyonobori on the championship team the next year. The second Eway became a television hit on TBS, as well, and created its first foreign superstar in British wrestler Robinson. Robinson had been British Empire heavyweight champion dating back to 1966, but in those days with little communication, he was almost a complete unknown outside of Europe and the European articles in a few of the American magazines that covered that continent. The few American wrestlers who had wrestled in Europe in that period would rave about Robinson, believing him to be the greatest shooter of the era, but colorless as a pro with the tag. There is nobody alive who could beat him, but he can't draw flies. In late 1968, Yoshihara brought Robinson to Japan and put together a tournament to crown a real world heavyweight champion, bringing top international stars from around the world. The top North Americans were locked up with JWA through its membership in the NWA, which included noted tough guys like George Gordienko and Peter Maivia. Robinson won the tournament to become the first champion. After the retirement of Toyonobori, Sugiyama was clearly the top native star in the group, and his chase of Robinson became the main singles program, ending on May 19, 1970 in Sendai, when Sugiyama won the title, handing Robinson his first loss in Japan. At that time, Vern Gagne hooked up with Yoshihara, giving the Eway a pipeline to Awa talent, which kept the struggling company in business for many years. Sugiyama had main title defenses against several major Awa names, including former champions Edward Carpentier and Mad Dog Vachon. However, the promotion made the decision to go with bodybuilder Shozo Strong Kobayashi as its top star because of his physique and unique look, instead of the shorter and stockier Sugiyama. Sugiyama dropped the title on March 4, 1971 to transitional champion Bill Miller in Kokura. During that period, he and Kusatsu were IWA's dominant tag team. They first won the tag titles on February 23, 1970 in Hiroshima from Monster Roussimoff, Andre the Giant in his introduction to the Japanese wrestling world years before his U.S. debut, and Michael Nador. Roussimoff and Nador had won the previous bout between the two teams in Fukuoka to capture the vacant titles. They lost and regained the titles at the end of the year in a program with Larry Hennig and Bob Windham, Windham's first major push, just weeks before debuting with his Blackjack Mulligan gimmick in WWF. When Kusatsu left the IWA to wrestle in the Omaha area, there was a short program where Red Bastion and Billy Howard beat Sugiyama and Rusher Kimura on September 7, 1971 in Tokyo to win the vacant titles, before the Japanese team regained them on September 23, 1971 in Nagasaki, and held them through the next summer. When Kimura went to the U.S., he stayed with the promotion for only a few more months, leaving in September of 1972 to be one of the first recruits by Baba when he formed All Japan Pro Wrestling. The original plan was for Baba and Sugiyama to be the top tag team, but the ascension of Tsuruta changed that. With his status fading, he retired from pro wrestling in the fall of 1973 and started new business endeavors. He was also able for a short period of time to use his wrestling fame for several roles as a television comedian. He made a brief comeback in a 1978 angle for New Japan when he joined a heel group headed by Matsuda, with Saito and Umanosuke Ueda to feud with Inoki Sakaguchi, Kobayashi, and Riki Choshu. His funeral took place on November 25 in Nagoya, which included attendance by Sakaguchi and Tatsumi Fujinami from Pro Wrestling, as well as sympathy letters on display from several former prime ministers. The troubled life of the wrestler known as Billy Joe Travis came to an end on the evening of November 22, as he suffered a massive heart attack at his mother's home in London, Kentucky. He had just come back to his mother's house after a stint in a tanning bed, walked in the door, and had a massive heart attack. Travis had a drug reputation in wrestling for years, which was part of the reason he never maintained the stardom he had at a young age. But his father also died young. Travis was believed to have been in his early 40s. His real name was Gary Mize, and he was a great high school athlete, being Kentucky State High School champion in the high jump in the late 70s, which worked in pro wrestling as he was known in his youth for having a great draw kick. He never seriously pursued options he had in track in college, and after college, started as a wrestler, after having been a fan since childhood. He broke into pro wrestling in 1982 and was best known in the old Memphis territory, with his greatest success inside the ring coming in 1986 and 1987 when he and a young Jeff Jarrett were the top babyface tag team in what was still a strong territory. At the time, Travis was thought of in wrestling as one of the most promising young workers in the business, as someone who was thought to have the potential to be another near Bobby Eaton level performer, which was huge praise in that era since Eaton was considered top 10 in the ring in the world, but having more charisma. In particular, the 1987 program over the Southern Tag Team titles that the two had with Pat Tanaka and Paul Diamond was considered among the top in-ring programs of that year, but Travis' career never came close to its potential, or even that level again. While he continued to wrestle on and off until his death, his name was long forgotten in the discarded scrap heap of wrestlers gone bad. Perhaps the most famous incident in recent years regarding Travis was something that appeared to be a weird television angle, but was actually a shoot. In 1997, Travis was wanted by the authorities at the time for non-payment of child support. He hid out in probably the worst place possible, wrestling every Saturday morning on WMC TV in Memphis. Apparently the woman looking for him saw him on television as the show was syndicated into other markets. She called the police. The next Saturday morning, they went to the studio for him and actually arrested him while he was doing an interview on the TV show. Most watching probably figured it was some sort of a wrestling angle. At about 5'10" and 210 pounds, Travis didn't have the size or physique to hit the big circuits during his prime, but because he was a very good worker, he was able to be used well in a lot of the southern territories as both a babyface and a heel, most notably a singles feud with Jarrett after the team broke up. His wrestling career would stop and start in between troubles with the law, including a sex with an underage girl charge that took him away from wrestling while still at his peak. Travis actually started his career as a WWF television jobber during the days of the marathon tapings in the mid-80s. He got his first push in Tennessee in the spring of 1986 when he defeated Abdul Gaddafi, Danny Miller, on March 24 to win their international heavyweight title. After losing to Bill Dundee 6 weeks later, he left the territory for San Antonio. Fred Barron's Texas All-Star Wrestling in San Antonio was on its last legs. Barron was a local auto dealer who was the San Antonio promoter for World Class when it was doing huge in the market, and in a promotional war with Joe Blanchard's Southwest Championship Wrestling. As is often the case, there was a period when both companies did big business in the market, and then, because of frequent main event no-shows by the Von Erichs and a redundancy of overly violent matches in Southwest, both groups started fading. Barron ended up buying the Southwest territory, which he figured would give him control of the entire market, and renamed it Texas All-Star Wrestling. Travis was brought in as the young pretty boy babyface star, because he was a willing bleeder, girls liked him, and he had a great understanding of the ring psychology of that era on how to play a sympathetic underdog. He feuded that summer with Al Madril over their USA Championship. Travis held the title when Barron folded his territory in November. He returned to Tennessee at that point. With bleached blonde curly hair, Travis and Jarrett first won the tag titles in Memphis on November 17, 1986 from one of the many versions of the Sheepherders, Jonathan Boyd, and Bigfoot. It was the first major title for Jarrett, who was 19. Over the next year they were programmed with the likes of the RPMs, Mike Davis and Tommy Lane, Big Bubba, Fred Tugboat Ottman, and the Mighty Goliath and the Clones, the Kelly Twins. Jarrett then formed a hot tag team with another second-generation wrestler who at the time was considered one of the hot young wrestlers in the business in Pat Tanaka. After Tanaka went heel, he and Jarrett had Jarrett's hottest singles program to date. It turned into a tag team feud with Travis being brought back with Jarrett and Paul Diamond put with Tanaka. The matches were so hot it put all four on the national radar for the first time as being recognized as four of the top future stars of the business. It led to Tanaka and Diamond eventually getting a run as the top tag team in a dying Awa, but which still had national TV coverage from ESPN. The four guys were going all out every night in competition to see who could outdo each other and take the best bumps, which was difficult competition since almost nobody could take as hard bumps as Tanaka in those days. We were all young and busted our ass every night and had a hell of a lot of fun doing it, remembered Jarrett, who ended up being the only one of the four to reach the levels all four at the time were expected to hit. He had good psychology. He knew how to get the crowd behind the underdog babyface working a traditional tag team style. Travis later held the international title a second time in late 1987 for a brief feud with Manny Fernandez. He was also Scott Steiner's first regular tag team partner in 1988 over the CWA tag team titles, which the Southern Belts were renamed, with feuds with the RPMs and Gary Young and Don Bass. In 1989, he formed a tag team with Perry Action Jackson, holding those same titles after beating Robert Fuller and Brian Lee, and feuding with the brother tag team called Wildside of Mark Starr and Chris Champion. But his troubles with drugs, which may have gotten out of control during his runs in Puerto Rico, changed him. He developed a bad reputation in wrestling. The major promotions largely steered clear of him, and as a performer, he was never the same. He hung on wrestling on small-time area independents in between his Puerto Rico runs, but the motivation was gone. In 1997, in his last run with a full-time office, the one that ended with his televised arrest, he held the USWA Tag Team titles twice with Flash Flanagan, working programs with PG-13 and the WWF South African Truth Commission, Barry Bull Buchanan and The Interrogator, who later became known as Kurgan, before losing to Jerry Faith and Troy Haste a few months before the promotion. He went single after dropping the belts and feuded with and won the USWA title on June 14, 1997 in Memphis from Brian Christopher, holding it 4 weeks before losing to Spellbinder. Jarrett remembered the last time he saw Travis was at a Nitro in Memphis. He told Jarrett that he had retired from wrestling. About 10 minutes later, another person told Jarrett about an indie show that Travis was working on. Jarrett went back to Travis and said that he thought he had left wrestling, and Travis' new story was that he was only wrestling on weekends. He was still wrestling on small shows on occasions up until his death. He wrestled in several other territories during his career, most notably the old world-class territory in Texas and Continental in Alabama.